Good evening, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today we have a bookish bedtime instead of the usual bookish breakfast because I didn't really get my act together earlier on today. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a much-loved book from Lebanon called An Unnecessary Woman by Rabia Alameddine. And along with it, I wanted to share just a little bit of Lebanese history for context. I have scripted this video because I wanted to do it justice and I wanted to get my facts at least approximately right, but I haven't worked from a script in a very long time, so apologies if this feels stilted. I also don't know how my setup is going to work, so I've kind of balanced my phone on top of my screen and we'll just see how it goes. So, Lebanon is a tiny country in the Middle East, sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea, Syria and Israel. When I say tiny, for context, for those of you in the UK, Lebanon is smaller than Wales, not just a little bit, but significantly smaller than Wales. Packed into that space, you have got a coastal strip where most of the major cities are, and that's where the majority of the country's 6 million residents live. And then there is a large and very beautiful mountain range called the Mount Lebanon Range, I believe. Then the stunning Bekaa Valley, which is where a lot of wine and things like that are grown. And then there's another mountain range that goes into the border areas. Lebanon is a fantastically diverse country with a very long history of both independence and interactions with larger empires, from the Egyptians to the Ottomans. But it was after French colonial rule that it became a separate country, in part to appease the need to create a Christian-led space in that area. As such, the main religion is considered to be Maronite Christian, although that is not the majority religion anymore. Oh, I was trying to use a mouse that's not actually plugged into the computer. Good start. So there are many other Christian groups, as well as Sunni and Shia Muslim and Druze groups that live in the country as well. Between these groups there is a very delicate power sharing arrangement known as, this is a difficult word, consociationalism. I did practice saying this, consociationalism. I'll write it in the description. But basically it means that each religious group has to be represented in particular official positions so that there is always a balance between them. Unfortunately, the complexity of this system has been one of the reasons why Lebanon's politics has been effectively paralysed in recent months. But on the other hand, it is a system that has somewhat kept the peace in Lebanon since the civil war, which started in 1975 and continued with varying levels of intensity up until 1990. It ended with Syria and Israel occupying large amounts of Lebanese territory. The end of the war led to the first elections in 1992. Voter turnout was pretty low, but Rafiq Hariri, again reaching for the wrong mouse, a billionaire who had contributed a lot to the Taif peace agreement at the end of the war, was brought in as Prime Minister. He was in and out of office for about the next 13 years, and he also ploughed a lot of his personal money into regeneration projects as Lebanon gradually restabilised. So you have like the Rafiq Hariri Hospital or the Rafiq Hariri Airport, and there's a real mark of the impact that he had on the country with his wealth and his political clout. So Rafiq Hariri's assassination on the 14th of February 2005 caused significant repercussions and very swiftly led to the formation of two political blocs, the 8th March group and the 14th of March group. These groups are still very important to Lebanese politics today, but it's a very hot topic and quite changeable, and definitely very complex. Suffice to say that following the assassination, Syrian troops were forced to withdraw from Lebanon by the Cedar Revolution, which was largely a 14th March thing. And the following year, Lebanon was rocked again by the 33-day July conflict with Israel, which left over 1,000 people dead. You don't need a degree in Middle Eastern history to know that Israel and Lebanon continue to be not the best of friends, and the long-standing conflicts between them are reflected in many cultural works from Lebanon. So when looking at those, I think it's important to remember the context of that tension and the very present memory that a lot of people have about those recent conflicts. Whether or not seeing the full perspective of those conflicts, obviously there is two sides to all of these stories. So over the years, Lebanon has taken in many waves of refugees, such as Armenians, Palestinians and Syrians. At one point in 2015, it was estimated that 1 in 5 people in Lebanon were refugees from the Syrian conflict. Some of those waves of refugees have been very well integrated into Lebanon, and some have remained effectively segregated and kept living in very specific zones with restrictions as well on kinds of employment that people can access and education and so on. In recent years, since 2005, things have remained pretty complex for Lebanon. Although it's not an oil-producing state, falling oil prices from 2014 affected business in the area, so that started doing damage to the economy, and things have been very much up and down since then. In October 2019, Lebanese citizens began to seriously protest as a result of new planned taxes that were going to have a significant impact on people's lives, and those protests grew to be called a revolution. The Lebanese revolution from October 2019 had some successes, but unfortunately 2020 happened. COVID restrictions happened. Lebanon was able to actually avoid a first wave of coronavirus through quite strictly following the restrictions that were implemented. But unfortunately that was followed on the 4th of August by the blast, the explosion of improperly stored aluminium in Beirut's port area, which led to things starting to unravel, including the COVID situation to then start to get worse. Investigations are still ongoing into the situation that led to the blast, but certainly people in Lebanon think that a huge amount of corruption is implicated in the situation, and I think most Western governments agree, and the French President of France? Macron has been very heavily involved in trying to see a way through for Lebanon in terms of resolving some of the political tensions that are ongoing. So these events had an incredibly destructive effect on so many lives and livelihoods. The average citizens of Beirut have been rebuilding by themselves because of a lack of government input, or else moving abroad or finding other ways to get by. But in that time, political and economic difficulties have only deepened, is what I wrote, sorry. There is huge inflation. Sorry, the camera arm is kind of in front of the script. There is huge inflation ongoing, for instance. So, for instance, I just now looked up the rate of the Lebanese pound, and it is $1 to 8,860 Lebanese pounds, but the official rate is still stuck at $1 to 1,500 Lebanese pounds. So there is a huge disparity between those, which, as you can imagine, does not actually encourage people to use the official banking system. So there's a lot of kind of black market activity and restlessness in that department as well. That said, it is a fantastic country full of really wonderful, welcoming people with incredible levels of education and resourcefulness. Most people are very happy to converse in English, French or Arabic, take your pick, and are working literally day and night to continue their lives and keep going in spite of all of the difficulties. So that is very much a brief summary of Lebanon. I've said a lot, but I'm sure you can tell that I've skimmed over huge amounts in the interest of brevity. Now, I promised in a recent video that I made about favourite books from 2020 to do a review of some of the books that I read while I was in Lebanon. And I decided that in order to do them justice, I would actually write my thoughts down and make a proper review. And then I found out that I had so much to say about Lebanon and about one of the books in particular that I had to do just one book for this video, if that makes sense. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair to squeeze the other two books in at the end. So today I have a short review for you of An Unnecessary Woman by Rabi Alameddine. This book was published in 2013 and I really enjoyed it. So Rabi Alameddine is a Lebanese American author. There is not a vast amount of information about him on his website or on the internet in general. There is not even an about the author page in this book, so I would say that he's probably quite a private individual. But he was born in Amman, Jordan, and raised between Lebanon and Kuwait. He left Lebanon roughly around the time of the start of the Civil War, so I think calculating from what it says on Wikipedia, I think he left in about 1976, so just after the start, and he went on to live in England and the US, and he now lives some of his time in Beirut and some in San Francisco. I was fascinated to hear actually that I only found that out this evening, that he wasn't physically in Lebanon during the war, because so much of this book is about how entrenched the character feels in the history of her city, and particularly at moments like the Civil War. Not having been living in Beirut at that time obviously in no way means that he didn't experience the Civil War. He would still have been so very heavily tied to his home country, but I was amazed that he managed to capture that atmosphere so effectively and so convincingly, that kind of atmosphere of conflict. Another thing he is able to capture very convincingly in this book is character, specifically female characters. For a long time, I thought Rabi' was a woman's name. It's in Arabic, it means spring. I think it should be pronounced something like Rabia, like there's an ayn on the end of it. But yeah, excuse my Arabic pronunciation. And then I found out that it was a guy's name, and then I found out that he was a man, and I was amazed that he had imagined so many women with so much subtlety in this story, because not that men can't write good female characters, but this book is really about female spaces and female relationships, mothers and daughters, neighbours and dear friends. It revolves around the amazing female character of Alia, and Alia is an older woman living alone who devotes her life to the task of translating books into Arabic via French and English. She is both intensely intelligent and intensely restricted, both by her society and by her self-imposed rules and routines. The book opens with her accidentally dyeing her hair blue, as you can see on the cover, in response to some catty remarks from her neighbours about the fact that her hair was getting old and going kind of like yellowy white. And it spirals from there through decades of Alia's memories and her present-day life. Alia lives a life engaged in a web of references to stories and memories, and gradually we become aware of common themes in the books that she is most interested in that give us clues to her past and her psychology, I suppose. I love this book so much, and I tried to foist it on all of my colleagues after I'd done with it, reading it in Beirut. So I would love to hear if any of you happen to have read it, and if you did, so just what do you think of it? I had, I guess, a particularly special relationship with this book in particular because I started reading it on my way to Lebanon on the Kindle. I bought it before I went, and the impression that Alameddine gives of Beirut, like he talks about the pavements disappearing and the unforgiving traffic where she talks about having to dive through the traffic, and she thinks like the day that she's actually old is the day when she can't keep up with the state of the traffic. And that was very much the impression that I was getting from the city in my first few days and weeks there. Then my colleague took me along to this wonderful place called Alia's Books, and this cafe is in fact named after the Alia of An Unnecessary Woman, which was just a fantastic connection for me. So Alia's Books is a cafe and a bar and a bookshop. It sells new and secondhand books in English, French and Arabic, and I was able to buy this actual physical copy there and read it in paper form whilst drinking lovely coffee with much delight. So I did want to take some pictures and maybe film a short video there because it's a really gorgeous cafe that would be totally at home in, you know, like any hipster area of any city anywhere. But unfortunately with lockdowns and working extra days, like I didn't go as often as I initially hoped that I would before I knew what like my working patterns would be like and so on. But I'm going to link below to their Instagram so that if you want to, you can go and take a look at the beautiful interiors that they have. So Alia's Books is in an area of Beirut called Gemazi. I always want to say Gemazie, which is completely wrong. Gemazi. And like many of its neighbours, it was utterly gutted by the blast. Seeing the pictures that they've posted online of the damage, you wouldn't believe that it could be done, but by the time I was there in November, everything in the cafe had been repaired, everything was running beautifully as normal, and with just a great friendly team behind everything. Nevertheless, the economic impact of an event like that on a business has got to be profound. So if you do happen to be in Beirut, I highly recommend spending some time there, browsing for books, buying books there, because it's a really lovely place and I don't think you would regret going there. So anyway, that is a short review of An Unnecessary Woman by Rabi' Alameddine. I definitely could talk more about this book, but I don't want to bore you all. And a little bit of history and cultural kind of stuff from Lebanon as well. I have 2 more books that I read from Lebanon, so let me know if you would like to hear about those. Let me know what you think about this book, and yeah, I would like to talk to you guys and hear more from you. And if not, I'll be back next Thursday. Take care. I was going to try and pause the video by pressing spacebar on my laptop. That's not how this works.